Hello, welcome to my Deadlock series. In this episode I will talk about the interface of the game. I have received a lot of helpful feedback for the interface. Thank you. I also fixed some issues with the pet animation and the sorting order. So the last Friday I decided to get into designing an interface for the game. The interface will include three components: health, dash cooldown and pet status. I didn't want to show too much information on screen, as I prefer a more immersive experience and a huge interface will penalize that. This was my first design of the interface, but I didn't really like that design, so I tried something simpler and cleaner. On top there is the health bar, followed by the dash cooldown and then the pet status. This pet status image will indicate when the pet is hungry, scared or just happy like in the example. The idea was to make a background image for the pet's body, and then add an image for the face. This way I would not need to draw a body for each expression, but this approach was a bit limited. I will tell you about that later. Also I wanted to make the health bar and the dash bar scalable, so I can resize them according to the player's health and dash ability. For that, I will have to make some adjustments in Unity, and the image couldn't be packed with other images. That was my first mistake. I jumped back into Unity and started adjusting the interface image. The canvas I used was scalable, using a resolution reference of 320 by 180 pixels. When I added the health bar image is when I realized I needed this image to be individual, so I can resize it as a full rect. But it was helpful to figure out the pixels per unit ratio for the interface canvas. Using a sprite I made new images for the dash and the health bar, and used the previous image for the pet facial expressions. Then I isolated the corners of the bars so I can resize them easily. This will let me use different sizes when the player levels up and gets more health or faster dash cooldown. The extractor of the bar will consist of three images: border, background and fill. The border is the image I made in a sprite. The background will be a dark color, to give the bar some contrast. This background will only show when the fill goes down. And the fill, that will indicate the actual amount of points that the player has. For managing the movement of the bar itself, I use a slider component. This component is great for making this kind of bars, as it has a value that you can modify through code that updates the look of the bar. You can set the max value, use whole numbers for this value, or even change the direction on which the bar is filled. I created an interface manager to handle all things related with the UI. All I needed was reference to the sliders I created and a couple of functions to handle the behavior of the bars. There is a component on the player object called hit points. This component will be in charge of updating the health bar of the interface manager. Here is a small test with the health bar interface. I noticed a bug where the enemies weren't close enough to attack the player. To fix this, I only had to modify a value in the enemy AI component. Now it's working properly. I recreated this effect for the dash bar, but it will act a bit different. When the player is able to dash, the bar will be full, but when there is a cooldown on the ability, the bar will show how much time is left to being able to use the dash again. However, the functions I needed for this bar were similar to the health bar. I reset the max value of the dash bar to 1 and use a scale of 0 to 1 to indicate the cooldown. To manage the bar I needed to go into the player permission component. This component lets the player controller know when it's possible to use the dash ability. When the dash countdown is started, this component will tell the interface to update the dash bar. It will slowly fill up until the dash is ready to be used again. But I did something wrong, as the bar was starting at the 80% of the bar. The problem was that I didn't have in mind the time when the dash is started. Adding this time to the equation will fix the issue. I was pretty happy with the result, but I thought that the interface was hardly noticeable. I tried different outlines to make the bars pop. The idea was to make them contrast with any background, so I used black and white colors. Then I posted a preview of the interface on Reddit and got a lot of feedback. A lot of people pointed out that the bar might go better on top of the player, as being in the top left corner was hard to keep track of the cooldown. So I started working on this new bar. I needed to create a new canvas and attach it to the player to follow his movement. However, the functionality was pretty much the same, so I didn't have to code anything. Here was the result. This way was better to keep track of the cooldown, but it was a bit annoying that the bar was always visible. I needed to code some functions to hide the bar when there is no need of showing it. Also, for polishing, a nice fade in and fade out effect would be nice. The problem to create this fade effect is that I didn't have a reference of all the images that compose the bar. Border, fill and background images. So I had to add this reference to the interface manager and create some functions. And, of course, the bar should start completely transparent. Here was the result. I messed up the fill color of the bar, but it was working great. I could even adjust the fade in or fade out speed by changing just a value. With the fill color fixed, this was the final result. Then I asked for the community's help again. I thought that the online was too much and will be annoying for the player. Some people thought that with online looked better, others preferred without it. But then someone pointed out that maybe it didn't need a bar at all. The cooldown was short enough to be implied with a small particle effect or audio cue. I decided to go with a small flash in the player's sprite to create this effect. For this, I will need to create a shader, but I didn't know too much about shaders. So I found this video about creating the effect I needed. CodeMonkey is a great channel for learning how to use different aspects of Unity. I highly recommend you to check it out, there is a link in the description. The idea of this effect is to have a transparent layer at the top of the player sprite. When the flash is needed, this layer will change its color and opacity and show it on the top of the player. This will be great for creating a damage effect in red, for example. This is the final result of the shader. I have two different colors, one for the base of the sprite and another for the tint that overlays it. Having this shader in place, I needed to create a material based on it. With this material, I can change any of the two colors to create cool effects. But for applying those effects in runtime, I needed to create a shader manager. This will be accessed from anywhere to give the player a new color and a duration for it. The effect will start with full opacity and then will fade during this duration. The link of the shader manager with the rest of the objects of the game is the interface manager. If we had a reference to the shader manager and set the information to change the color or the duration of the fade effect. Having this, I can create a white flash when the dash is ready to be used again. I can also make the hit point component create a red flash to indicate that the player has been damaged. Here is a test of both effects in game. This was way better than having a bar on top of the player, but something was missing. On audio cue will be great to reinforce these effects. I know a great program to create retro sound effects, it's called VFXR. It's completely free and with it you can create very interesting sounds. I will leave a link in the description. As I called the interface manager to generate these effects, I had to do the same with the audio manager. When the dash is ready, the audio manager will play an audio effect. This audio effect is determined by the player permissions component. I also added a variable for the volume. Although I wasn't convinced to use this sound effect, the system was in place. I could replace this audio file later. I decided to put the dash bar below the health bar. This way the player will have two ways of knowing when the dash cooldown is done. At this point, I noticed a strange clipping issue that I will fix later. Having a sound and visual effect for the dash was great, but I wanted to reinforce the hit effect. When the player gets hit, there is a small pause, a red blink, and a different sound. I would like to add a subtle screen shake. As I use Cinemachine for this project, this is an easy task. There is a property to add noise to the camera's position. I learned how to do this by watching a tutorial of CodeMonkey. I will leave a link in the description. The screen shake was working correctly, but I needed to adjust the intensity a bit. I think the effect is subtle enough. What do you think? I also added a sound effect for when the player gets hit. This was the final result. I didn't think that the sound effects I made in VFX-R were working, so I searched for new ones. VFX-R is great for making retro-style sound effects, but I don't think that style goes with the sounds I have in this game. I also added an array of sounds that the player could make when getting hit. This way it will add a bit of randomness. This was the result. Next, I decided to change the pet status indicator. As I told you earlier, the approach was to have a background and then add the expression on top. This ended up not working for me as I wanted to animate the status image. That way will look more alive. For now I only made the mildly happy animation. This was the result of all effects combined: shader, sound effects, screen shake and the animator interface. I used the new shader to indicate the player's immune time. He becomes transparent when he is immune. And to finalize this week, I fixed an issue with the pet's animation. It was bouncing way too much, as I messed up the animation when I exported it. I also managed to fix the issue I told you earlier, the one about the sorting order. It turned out to be an easy solution. Rather than changing the sorting order through code, I had to move the pet's position a bit to change its depth. I reused the function but changed the content to make this change. As you can see in this test, the issue is fixed. That's it for this week. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing. I will upload my progress on the game every week. If you want more frequent updates, check my social sites in the description. Thanks for watching. See you next week.